오늘 전반적인 진행은 저희 브라질에서 온 저희 GG 앰버서더 앨리스 양이 진행을 해줄 예정인데요. 앨리스 양이 소개하도록 하겠습니다. Alice, can you introduce about yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Alice from Brazil. I'm 17 years old and I'm a second year high school student. And I'm Brazil ambassador today here. And I'm really honored to be with all of you today. So I hope you have questions about the professor and we can talk to him today pretty well.
Thank you. 네, 오늘 강연은 알렉산더 머피 교수님이 전반적으로 진행을 하는 것이 아니고 저희의 질문으로 만들어가는 거기 때문에 저희가 사전에 학생들한테 질문을 받아서 이미 한번 전달해 드렸는데요. 새롭게 질문이 생기면 제가 정리를 해서 전달해 드릴 예정입니다. 그러면 곧 알렉산더 교수님이 30분에 접속을 하실 예정이어서 잠시 쉬는 시간을 가지면서 질문 작성과 알렉산더 교수님에 대한 정보를 탐색하는 시간 가지고 계시면 될 것 같습니다. 저희는 30분에 교수님 접속하시면 다시 본격적으로 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
You. It's good evening.
Yeah, hello, and Alice from Brazil will proceed this program today. So I will introduce her to you. She's Alice. Alice, can you introduce about yourself?
Yes, I'm Alice from Brazil. I'm a high school student, second year high school student, and I'm 17 years old. I study at a Catholic school in my city, that is Rio de Janeiro. And I'm really glad to be here with everyone and to answer some questions. I mean, you answer the questions, not me.
Indeed. Well, let me just start by saying I'm pleased to be here, at least remotely. I was actually in Korea just a couple of weeks ago, actually a little less than 2 weeks ago, and just the timing of other commitments didn't make it possible for me to stay on for the summer school. But it looks like an interesting program, and I think Professor Kim Ije gets a lot of credit for putting this together and bringing you all together. And I hope it's already off to a good start and that you're having a good experience during the summer school. So I was just actually 20 minutes ago or so, I was sent some questions. Do you want me just to answer the questions that I received, or how would you like to conduct the session?
We wrote on a document some questions about the students, and you can answer the questions they send you, and
Okay.
then I can show you I can share my screen with the questions.
Okay, I actually have this. I have the questions in front of me, so it's okay.
Okay, better.
Great. Okay, so I'll just start with the first question, which is somebody studying. Oh, I'm getting some feedback here, curiously. Oh, some French studies at Yonsei University, and it was about environmental issues and what geography can bring to the study of environmental issues. And obviously, uh, one of the clearest answers to this would be just geography's sensitivity to regional differences, the differences in different contexts, which was part of what the question was asking. There's all sorts of geographical studies now that, for example, in climate change, are helping us to understand in a much more detailed way what's going on where. And one of the examples I like to cite is some work that has been done by actually a bunch of folks, but including my colleagues here at the University of Oregon, looking at past climate patterns based on the pollen at different levels in lake beds. And that, the pollen is a function of the vegetation that existed around the lake. And by seeing what was happening at different time periods, You can understand better what the natural system is doing over time, how it's changing over time. And that in turn allows us to see not just how the natural system was changing, but how much humans are contributing to the substantial changes that are going on right now. So those things have fed a lot into climate models, for example, that we're trying to use to make more sense of the climate system. But I think those are the kind of more obvious points. But I think perhaps a more sort of subtle, interesting points come from the way in which geography tends to take a more integrative focus on different places and regions. So let's take an example like alternative energy, wind energy projects. So I had a student some years ago who was interested in wind energy in Spain. And he was looking at various places where wind energy, wind farms, as they call them, had been established in Spain. And you might think that, well, it would make most sense to establish these in places where the wind was most consistent, relatively strong, and that had some influence on where these wind energy projects were placed. But what he found out, and I think it was maybe not even too surprising if you think about it, is that where you put a wind farm is not just a question of how best to capture a particular environmental variable, but it's also a political question. Where are local authorities open to being able to establish the land use regulations that make it possible for a wind farm to be developed in a particular place? So understanding the sort of geographical distribution of alternative energy is not just an environmental question. It's a political question. It's a socioeconomic question as well. And I think it's looking at issues in those ways where geography's real value comes to the fore because of the geographical tendency to think in an integrative way about places and regions. Okay, so maybe I'll just continue on. So the second question, Shojin Lee from Yongjin National University of Education, asking about transportation networks, comparing Chicago and Seoul, which is a kind of interesting comparison, and the kind of advantages and disadvantages that come into play when establishes these transportation networks. It's sort of interesting. Of course, one of the differences between Chicago and Seoul has to do actually again with the political organization of space and it right now, because Chicago was, of course, a very central location when it was established. And when Seoul was originally established as a capital, it was very central in the Korean Peninsula. Although, of course, now with the division of the Korean Peninsula, it's no longer as central as it once was. But the other difference is that Chicago is the place in the North American continent where two great river basins come together. The whole Mississippi-Missouri drainage basin, which drains the whole central part of the North American continent, and then the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway, which drains the whole northeastern part of the North American continent. So putting these transportation networks in Chicago made it possible to take advantage of its centrality, both in terms of a potential railroad network, but also in terms of shipping, inland shipping within the North American continent. So that's a sort of a difference between Seoul and Chicago. But the real question is, how do these transportation networks affect less developed regions? And of course, as a good geographer, one would always say, well, it depends on the context. But I think one of the interesting things one can learn about thinking about these transportation networks is that inevitably, as they're developed, they end up advantaging some places more than others. So that as the rail network was being developed out from Chicago, there was actually a great deal of efforts on the part of local authorities in some places to make sure the railroad came through their town as opposed to another town. Because if it did, that was a huge advantage to that town and a huge disadvantage to the other town. And inevitably, it's going to be built in one place or another, and that's going to have these differential impacts, which can lead to kind of an uneven development problem even within less developed regions. So that's kind of the most general answer I would give to how these transportation networks affect less developed regions. Okay, so the third, also from the same university, is a question. Well, it's very kind of you to say that I've had a career that you'd want to emulate. That's gratifying. But the question is really about there are various problems that are coming to the fore these days, like environmental pollution, like global warming, and curious what problematic geographical problems or issues these days that I see. And of course, those two are surely two of them. But I would say two other things that really sort of call out to me. One is maybe not surprisingly, given my sort of specialization in political geography, is the sort of changing geopolitical set of circumstances we're dealing with. I mean, there's constant changes that are going on, but the changes that are going on in the ways that countries and peoples relate to one another, how those affect and shape both ideas people have about other parts of the world, how they affect trading relationships, how they affect the ways in which different kinds of alliances can or cannot collaborate in dealing with issues and problems, including environmental issues and problems. And then the other issue that comes to my mind that is I see as particularly problematic or a particularly important geographical issue is actually the inequality issue. There's a New York Times columnist by the name of Tom Friedman who some years ago wrote a book called The World is Flat. And his argument was, it was based on something that made some sense in a way. His argument was, people involved in certain kinds of, let's say, financial or banking or, banking is financial or technological or other kinds of activities because of globalization, because there have been these poles of development that have developed around the world, that now maybe somebody working in New York is much more actually in a similar position to various people in Bangalore in India than in parts of, a more rural New York State. And he was saying, it's a flattening world, that we're increasingly not seeing these great differences. And I looked at that book when it came out, and I thought, well, he makes a certain point that's valuable, but he also misses actually there's still extraordinary inequalities in the world today. And understanding those and even understanding how they feed into something like the ways in which now there's a strong resistance to globalization that's going on in some places because people feel like globalization has worked against the interests of some communities and has led to the hollowing out of economic opportunities in some places and so forth. These are key issues. And I think some of the political challenges that we face today, both at the country level and at the global level, are related to inequality issues. Okay, so moving on to the next one from Na Young Kim. So this is a question about the seriousness of geographic illiteracy. And the question is, what are the problems that can occur if geographical illiteracy becomes more severe? And what can be helpful in terms of social and national aspects if a broader understanding of geography is achieved? Well, I would say a couple of things. There's a lot one could say about this, but we live in a time of a lot of information fragmentation. With social media, people get their news, their information in different kinds of ways. And there's various kinds of biases depending on where you get your information. And there's a lot of questions about, what news is real and what news is fake. Well, if you don't have some sense of the world and how it's organized, you have no critical sensibility you can bring to bear when you're confronted with some information about what's going on in the world, and you don't know necessarily what the legitimacy of the source is or whatnot. So it seems to me it's a particularly pressing problem right now, that is to say, geographic literacy, precisely because we live in this world of information fragmentation with lots of questions about, what to make sense, how we make sense of different kinds of ideas, and information that we receive. So I like to say that any kind of democratic system re, re, is cannot really function without a relatively educated populace that can bring some kind of background and critical sensibility to what they're hearing and seeing. And to me, geographic literacy is so critical to that, and therefore actually to democratic political structures, as they proceed in the contemporary world. Then the question also is what can be helpful in terms of social and national aspects if a broader understanding of geography is achieved. I think it's kind of speaks to what I have been talking about. The reason it is so helpful is that it can advance actually some kind of better politics and the integrity of elections and the ability of people to process and what's going on and engage with it constructively. I think it's so key to have some kind of geographical sensibility to bring to bear in that regard. Okay, so then we have the question from Brazil, and wanted to know, while I was studying geography, what was the subject I liked the most and the subject I liked the least, and why? I suppose the subject I liked most, well, might be some combination of political and cultural geography. Maybe not surprising given the kind of work that I've ended up doing a lot through my career. But to me, these help to make sense of how the world is organized, why places are different from one another. They got me so interested in different places. I've always loved to try to gain some better understanding of what different places are like. And to me, cultural geography was a great sort of help in that regard. It spurred my interest, made me want to travel, made me want to visit places and so forth. I suppose in terms of least, well, I think all our brains work in different ways. And I don't want this to sound like I'm in any way not interested in what sort of more quantitative approaches can bring to geography, because I think they can bring a lot. And in fact, I've used them in some of my work, and I'm very impressed by often what we can do with geographic information systems and so forth. But I took a spatial statistics class that was a really tough one. It was actually taught by a guy from Scotland who was, I think, quite advanced in terms of spatial statistics, and I really struggled, to grasp at least some of the sort of higher end things that he was talking about. Maybe because it was a little more abstract and less, about people and places. That was the one maybe I liked the least. At the same time, I'm very glad I took it. Because as I noted, as I mentioned a minute ago, I actually ended up using quantitative methods in some of the work that I've done, and so I was glad to be exposed to that. It also just gave me insight when I'm reading articles that use quantitative and spatial analysis. It gave me a better understanding of what I'm reading and trying to understand. Okay, so then the next one was about how my understanding of the nation state has changed over time, especially with globalization and digital borders. This is actually a central issue of interest to me, and so I've actually written a couple of pieces related to this. I could talk for hours on this subject. But one of the most accessible would be a piece I wrote in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers. It was published a little over 10 years ago, called Territory's Continuing Allure. But then I kind of wrote a follow-up to that, which is published in Geografiska Annaler B, which is the Swedish human geography journal, just 2 or 3 years ago. These are easy to find on the web. But it's basically an argument that on the one hand, the nation state has inevitably changed a great deal in the face of globalization, in the face of technological developments that link us together in various ways, makes it possible to do what we're doing right now, that have changed the capacity of the nation state to function in some ways in the ways that it traditionally functioned. But at the same time, as much as that's happening, we have to be aware that actually territorial arrangements and structures still have a great deal of influence. There's a great deal of inertia to the political map, if you will. All you have to do is travel and know you got to get visas and deal with all those formalities to recognize this. But it's also very much evident in political movements that are going on around the world these days, with a variety of populist, nationalist movements taking hold and being quite influential in a variety of countries all over the world. And that's a testament to the fact that even though globalization and technological developments have in some ways eroded the significance of the nation state in its traditional form, that actually there's still a great deal of power to the territorial system that developed along with the modern state system. Okay, and then next to the last question was, which thinkers or books within or outside of geography have most influenced my work and perspectives? Gosh, there's so much I could say here. I think in political geography, the work of John Agnew has been particularly influential, even though I've mildly disagreed with him on some issues. I think his whole way of thinking so geographically about the world has been a great influence. I found the work of Martin Lewis and Karen Wigan in a book called The Myth of Continents extremely interesting, because it really encourages us to think critically about the spatial structures we use to make sense of the world. And to me, that's something that geography can bring to the world. I've collaborated in the past with a prominent geographer who actually was born in the Netherlands, worked in South Africa for a period, grew up in South Africa for a period of time, but did his PhD in the United States and actually traveled to Korea some years ago, Harm de Blay. He was one of the ones who really encouraged me to think more about communicating the nature and significance of geography outside of just the academy, outside of just other geographers. And that's, I guess, most expressed in the book that I wrote a few years ago, Geography, Why It Matters, which, of course, Professor Kim translated into Korean, and that I know you've heard about in the workshop. Okay, and then finally, if I could direct global attention to one underexplored geographic issue, what would it be? Oh, gosh, that's an interesting one. I think the most obvious answer to that right now would be there are so many issues about the geographical circumstances and changes that are coming along with AI that's clearly an area where geographical consideration needs to be given. Just a couple of examples. One would be the ways in which AI is going to increasingly put great strains on the energy production system, because these huge data servers that are handling AI, they're very energy intensive. So I think they're actually interesting sort of economic and then social impacts of the changing energy picture that are going to go along with AI. Then the second thing, which is much more obvious, is how the whole structure of employment is going to be changing, and that's going to lead to winners and losers in various ways. We need to be thinking about this geographically. What places are benefiting, what not? How can we ameliorate some of the disadvantages to less advantaged places, and so forth? So that would be, another issue. But if I were to think just in terms of less sort of academics things and more general things, I still think one of the great advantages to studying geography, and this relates to a couple of the other questions that were asked, is that it maybe particularly the question about geographical ignorance or illiteracy, is I think the geography has this capacity to undermine the stereotypes, many of them negative stereotypes people have about other parts of the world, and not just everyday people, policymakers, people of influence in economic and political circles. And I think sometimes we don't spend enough time actually thinking about and trying to understand how these geographically unfortunate, I would say, stereotypes we have about the world actually affect not just how people think about things, but how they act, how they react to what's going on in the world, with pretty negative consequences for everything from international relations to just people-to-people relationships from one part of the world to another. So there is a sort of quick effort to respond to some very interesting questions. There's, of course, always more that could be said, but I hope I've offered a few things that may be of some help, and I'd be happy. I know I've already exceeded what was originally scheduled for the amount of time for this session, but I'm certainly happy to stay on for a little bit longer and answer any questions or comments you might have.
So I think we have more questions. I can share my screen with some of other questions, or Soyeon can share the questions. Oh, I shared them. We have some more questions from other Korean students, and I will show you.
Okay.
Can you see it?
It just says now it's coming up. Okay, it's a little bit small, but
I
okay.
will try to make
No,
it
I can.
big.
I think I can see it. It's okay.
No, because I can't see it too. I use glasses.
Okay.
I'm almost
All right.
blind.
You'll just make it bigger. Okay. There are you. That's better. Okay. So yes, I visited Busan, Yeongju, Andong, other areas. As a geographer, what was your favorite experience in Korea? Ah, interesting. I think maybe because I started my trip in Busan and I ended up uh, just walking around, not the big tourist sites, but up in these little neighborhoods that were developing along the edges of hills. Busan's, pretty rugged topography right there. And walking around these tiny little streets, sometimes with a place you could walk that was not much wider than my shoulders, and getting a little bit of a sense of how different people were living. Ended up actually stopping and even though I don't speak Korean, having a little bit of exchange with a couple of people. It was just a great way to start off the trip. So that was just a wonderful experience. I have to say, I love the food too. I mean, different food in different places. Eating all the different dishes. That's just sort of something that really sticks in my mind as well. So, second question is visited the DMZ, and I had been there before. Uh, it's always. I went back because I was with my wife and she had not been there. It's always a kind of moving and in some ways, sad experience, of course, because you realize this set of circumstances that's now been going on for more than half a century. Having divided what historically was a single sort of cultural and political place. It's just I can't help but feeling sad. At the same time, it's one of great curiosity as well. The day I went, unfortunately, the weather wasn't great, so you really couldn't see very far. I went there actually in 2000, I guess it was 19, with Professor Kim and her son. We were able to see sort of quite a bit more, and it was kind of interesting to look across and um, you could see more. But it's just that sense of we're looking at unfortunately, a pretty entrenched geopolitical set of circumstances that we want to talk about and think about unification as a possibility, but it's so hard to think about how that might happen. Okay, so then the question about Harvard abolishing geography in 1948. What was the reason behind that decision? Did it cause any issues within the American academic community? And is it true that geography is making a comeback? So, geography was closed at Harvard. There were some small internal issues within the university, some disagreements between the central administration and people in the department, but that was not the overarching issue. The president of the university at the time had come to think of geography as a very descriptive kind of enterprise, something that was kind of more like writing encyclopedia articles about different places at a time when science was getting all the attention and geography seemed very sort of descriptive and not very analytical. And there was a fair amount of geography that you could say was that way at the time. So he made the argument, well, geography, maybe it's more a subject for primary and secondary schools, not for universities. I think it was obviously an extremely unfortunate decision. But it did have significant consequences because, if a university with the standing and prestige of Harvard closes a department, that's provides a sort of possibility for other universities. If they're in difficult financial times, they say, well, Harvard doesn't have a department of geography. We don't need one either. So actually, you had other prominent universities with even decades later, like Yale, like Columbia, that actually ended up closing their geography departments. Although now both those institutions, and indeed Harvard itself, has got some places where geography is happening on campus. I was actually involved at Harvard in helping to reestablish a geographic information unit that's now at Harvard. Geography is making a comeback or has made a comeback in U.S. universities to a degree. But I've been worried. If you had asked me that question 7, 8 years ago, I would have said absolutely. We had seen new programs being established. There's still a lot of universities, though, that don't have strong geography departments. But recently, with the combination of fiscal problems and so much focus on some narrow areas, I'm particularly smaller departments in the United States are actually having some trouble these days. So it's no longer quite the positive picture that it was a few years ago. Okay, so that actually speaks in part to what the status of geography is in the United States. Is it easy to be employed with geography as a major? Is an interesting question. So, yes and no. If you're looking for jobs where they say, we're looking for a geography major, maybe not so much, except that geography opens the door to a whole lot of different career possibilities. You can look at, actually, there's a careers page on the website of the American Association of Geographers. Many departments of geography have web pages that will list, 20, 30 different occupations, environmental, travel, planning, all sorts of things that students go on to do. So when I think about my students, well, my doctoral students mostly go on for academic positions. But I would say when I think about undergraduate students, I mean, some have gone into government, some have gone into actually the travel industry, planning of various sorts, map making, of course, GIS, geographic information systems, and so forth, has been a way that a lot of people have done. Students of mine have gone on to construct careers that relate to geography. So, what countries have the strongest geographical programs and provide the best geography education to their citizens? Maybe two different questions in a way. It's hard not to be impressed when you go to everything from mainland China to actually to Russia. Some geography departments are huge. I was for 4 weeks at Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou. Just at the end of my time, I was teaching at the University of Hong Kong this past winter, spring, and then I spent 4 weeks at Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou. They have over 90 faculty members, 90 faculty members in their geography department. They're big departments elsewhere in mainland China. I was giving a talk some years ago at St. Petersburg State University in St. Petersburg, Russia, and again, their geography department over 100 faculty members. It was huge. So those are examples of where geography is quite strong. And in terms of best geography education, it really depends a lot on the institutions within well, both those countries and other countries. So I still think the United Kingdom has some really strong geography programs in many ways, although I worry a little bit about the fact that physical and human geography have become too divided there in some ways, which I think is kind of unfortunate. Um, but yeah, I think there's still a lot of strength to geography in some of the other European countries. I think Finland is one of the places that has really strong geography programs. They're not necessarily huge, but they're really strong. The Netherlands is another example of a place with good and strong geography programs. But of course, these exist in other parts of the world as well, and I certainly don't know them all. Okay, so now we have somebody from Sejong Global High School interested in politics. So are there some correlations between geography and politics? Well, yes. I mean, I'm a political geographer, so it's what I spent my career doing. There are many conflicts, wars, and conflicts in modern society. What does this mean geographically? Is there any influence of geography on these conflicts? Well, um, let's just take the most simple example. How a political area how a politically significant area ends up being established in a particular place. What the boundaries of that are has a huge impact on what potentially ends up in conflict or what does not. How territory functions, how there's an integration between politics, culture, environment. These have great impacts on conflict. So, I start my political geography class saying, if you were in a politics department, you might take a comparative politics class, maybe that was focused on Europe, and you would start with saying, okay, what's the political system like in France? What's it like in Germany? What's it like in Italy? What's it like in Spain? Those are all good questions. But what about more basic geographical questions? What does it mean for the particular area of the Earth's surface that we call France to have come into being as a country? This had huge impacts on the history of conflict between France and Germany, on how people think of themselves as French. 800 years ago, the people living in southern France did not speak a language that was very close to what was spoken in Paris. Now they do. It's because a political territorial entity came to be established there that had an impact on how people came to think about themselves, of questions of us and them, and so forth. So it's just one example of many that we could provide that I think sort of illustrate why thinking geographically about space and spatial arrangements is so critical. Just one last example. The ways that geopolitical circumstances unfold have a huge impact, or are hugely affected, I should say, by how we tend to geographically divide up the surface of the earth. So the fact that the Middle East is often thought of as a region with sort of common set of issues and problems has led to actually, in my view, all sorts of actually problematic um, engagements with the region, because there's not a recognition of how diverse culturally, politically, socially the Middle East is. But the fact is that that's thought about as a region, and if that's your geographical conception geopolitically, that has a big impact on how the region is understood and how it's thought about. So it's just a couple of examples of what is a very good question, but one where I think I would just recommend even sort of looking at some basic texts in political geography would provide a lot of insight into the kinds of questions that are being asked there.
I think these are the questions now, and
Great.
thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure. I hope things are going well for the workshop. And so I see some about 12 screens on. Are there also people listening live to this, or is this just the group that's on the Zoom right now?
They are the separate students from Glover High School and other schools. And also, I think they're teachers.
Right. Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share some things with you. I hope I have said some things that you can think about during the course of the summer school. And please give my best regards to Professor Kim and thank her for translating my book and introducing it to you as part of the summer school.
And would you tell about your thoughts and feelings about your book and the summer school? Also, could you tell something to students in Korea for the finale?
Right. So, well, I mean, the book came about partly because I was concerned about the state of understanding of geography. I think many people just so think about it as memorizing place names and things like that, which is, I mean, it's useful to know some place names, of course, but that was the inspiration for writing the book. I wanted to write something that would be accessible to students, maybe a more general audience, that wasn't just a bunch of cartoons, but could actually provide without using a lot of jargon, just provide a lot of examples that help people understand how geographical thinking and approaches could be of help. And so it's been gratifying that the book has been actually picked up in several, not just in the United States and the UK, where English is the dominant language, but it's been now translated into Spanish, into Chinese, into Korean, and actually an Italian version of the book is coming out in September. So the gratifying part of this is to see that I don't care about myself. I care about people having an understanding of what geography is. So for Korean students, I would say, Korea, I think, shares a challenge that we have in the United States, that often geography is not valued as much as it should be. It's maybe not as well understood as it should be. So to me, I would encourage people. I would encourage Koreans to think carefully and seriously about what geography can offer beyond just sort of simply, knowing where things are on a map. And to the extent that I have a sense of the summer school, I would just hope it, and in fact, I'm quite sure that it's helping to broaden the understanding of the participants in the summer school about the nature and importance of geography.
I wanted to ask a question about how geography is on schools, because as I can see from your perspective and the Korean perspective, geography is it's not talked enough, but in Brazil, since I was a kid, I had lots of geography classes, and I have like 3 hours of geography class per week. And I wanted to know why is like that, because since I was a kid, I always had geography classes, and our geography courses on college are very, very important, and they sometimes make appearances on international events that happen in Brazil. And I wanted to know why it's not very powerful as is on my country.
Yeah, that's great, and Brazil is a good example. I've actually had the chance to lecture at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and I know a little bit about the Brazilian context. And your example is exactly right, and it's true in other places too. I spent a year when I was growing up in a Japanese high school, and also there were many hours a week that were devoted to the study of geography. So, but it's highly variable. You know, there are countries like Brazil and Japan where this sort of normally happens, but other places, in the United States is a bad example of this, where it has not happened so much. I think 100 years ago it was more common. But then what they started a movement to sort of put together history, geography, you know, what we think of as sociology, economics, kind of all wrapped together in what they called social studies. And geography got kind of lost in the mix in that. So that's the study. That's what happened in the United States. But I worry about a place like Italy these days, because Italy geography used to be much more central in the schools. But I think again, it suffers from this challenge in many places where people think, well, okay, you know, yeah, it's useful in third grade to, you know, have a map with some puzzles and know something about it. But actually thinking geographically, it's not well understood. And so it becomes an easy subject to say, okay, well, we only have a certain number of hours in the day, and maybe, you know, we can't spend as much time on it as we should. So it's a highly variable picture. But I'm glad you said something about Brazil in particular, though, because actually an example that I could give to uh, to the question I was asked originally about, you know, places where geography is more important and better established, and I think Brazil's a good case of that. So I'm going to have to go in just a minute, but I do see in the chat there's at least one question in English that I can read. I'm a geography teacher in the humanities and social sciences. Recently, students who choose geography tend to avoid physical geography, especially geomorphology. There are concerns and confusion about the identity of geography and geographic education will consist of physical and human geography. I'm curious about the professor's opinion on this. Yeah, I think it's really unfortunate. Even though my emphasis is more in human geography, I love physical geography. In fact, geomorphology is probably my favorite part of physical geography. And I tried in my book, even though I'm a human geographer, I tried in my book to use a lot of examples from physical geography as well, because I think actually physical geography, maybe some students sort of they avoid it because they think, oh well, it's just going to be too boring or rote or maybe even difficult. But I mean, to me, it's just it opens up so much of just a basic understanding of the places we move through. You know, you take the train from Seoul to Busan, as I did. You look out the window, and if you have some physical geographic understanding, you actually can appreciate much more what you're going through than what you might otherwise. I think physical geography actually is very important, and we need to fight against this kind of idea either that it's you know, sort of too boring, because it's not at all, or too difficult. And I also think we need to fight against the idea that physical and human geography always need to be separated. To me, living in a world with so many of the environmental issues and challenges that we face today, it's really critical that we keep physical and human geography in communication with one another. To me, to understand a place, you really have to understand both the physical and the human circumstances. And if you did look at my book, I start out with the example of Lake Chad, and in the very first chapter. And to me, that's a great example of why we need to think in terms of both physical and human geography. All right. Well, good luck with your continuing summer school, and I'm glad I had the chance to speak with you today, and thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thanks for talking a lot about geography today.
Okay.
Um, and Alice, can you tell something about to finish this meeting? Yeah.
Well, it has been a pleasure to have you today. It's a big honor, and you weren't able to come last summer school, but we are happy to have you here now, even if it's online. And I hope we can have more opportunities together. And maybe next summer school you can come here and we can meet personally and talk with everyone.
All right. Thank you very much and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.